I'm Lucia, 38 female. I live in a small, quiet apartment that smells of old paper and lemon tea, a sanctuary I've built for myself 2 states away from my childhood home. As an archivist, I spend my days preserving the histories of others, finding comfort in the order and truth of documented facts. It's a peaceful life, one that was recently shattered by the loss of my mother, Helen, and the greed of my brother, Marcus. This story isn't just about a will or a house. It's about how I used my quiet skills to unravel a lifetime of manipulation and expose a lie so brazen it almost succeeded. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. My mother, Helen, was a force of nature packed into the frame of a retired nurse. She had a practical, no-nonsense approach to life, but her heart was immeasurably soft, especially when it came to her garden. The sunroom, a glass-walled extension she'd had built onto the back of our childhood home, was her paradise. It was filled with orchids, ferns, and the sweet scent of jasmine that climbed one of the walls. That room was where she did her best thinking, and it was where we had our most important conversations. The last of those conversations happened 3 months before she passed away. I had driven down for the weekend, a trip I made every other week. Marcus, who lived only 20 minutes away, visited far less frequently, usually when he needed something. That Saturday, Mom was unusually quiet. She sat in her favorite wicker chair, a half-finished cup of chamomile tea cooling on the table beside her, and watched the finches at the bird feeder. Her breathing was a little more labored, a little shallower than the last time I'd seen her. The cancer was progressing, and we both knew time was becoming a luxury. "Lucia, honey," she said, her voice soft but clear, "we need to talk about what happens after." I pulled up a stool, taking her hand. It felt fragile, the skin thin like parchment over her knuckles. "Mom, you don't need to worry about that now." She gave a weak smile, but her eyes were firm. "Oh, yes, I do. Worrying is a mother's prerogative even at the end, especially at the end." She squeezed my hand. "You know I love your brother. Marcus is my son and I will always love him, but I am not blind." This was a familiar territory for us. Marcus had always been the charming, reckless one. He had a salesman's smile that could talk anyone into anything, a skill he'd honed into a career selling cars. But behind that smile was a deep-seated irresponsibility. He was constantly in some kind of financial trouble, laid out by our parents when our dad was alive, and then by our mom after he passed. He saw our mother's generosity not as a gift, but as an entitlement. "He and Jenna have been making comments," Mom continued, her gaze shifting to a vibrant purple orchid. "Hints about the house. How it's too big for one person, how they could help me manage my finances. They see this house not as a home, but as a cash machine." I sighed. I'd heard it too. During my visits, if Marcus happened to be there, he'd talk loudly about the rising property values in the neighborhood. Jenna would chime in about how much easier it would be for Mom if they just moved in and took care of everything, including her bank accounts. They treated her like she was already gone, a ghost in her own home. "Mom, it's your house, your money. You don't owe him anything," I said, trying to sound reassuring. "I know that," she said, her voice gaining a bit of its old, steely strength. "And I won't let him squander what your father and I worked our entire lives for. This house is your inheritance, Lucia, yours and mine. It holds our memories." She looked around the sunroom, at the pictures on the wicker table, me at my college graduation, a family portrait when Dad was still with us, a silly photo of her and me covered in flour from a baking mishap. Marcus was conspicuously absent from these recent photos. "What are you saying, Mom?" She reached for her tea, and I helped steady her hand as she took a sip. "I'm saying that I have made arrangements. Mr. Finch has my final will. It's clear, it's legal, and it's ironclad. The house, its contents, and the majority of my savings go to you." I felt a knot in my stomach. "Mom, Marcus will be furious. He'll cause a scene." "Let him," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "His anger is his own problem. I've left him a sum of money, more than he deserves, frankly. It will be enough to clear his current debts and give him a small cushion. But that's all. I will not enable his foolishness from beyond the grave." Then she leaned closer, her expression turning serious. "But I need you to promise me something, Lucia. He will not take this well. He might try something desperate. You are methodical, you are careful, just like your father. You see the details others miss. When the time comes, I need you to be strong, but more importantly, I need you to be smart. Don't let him bully you. Trust Mr. Finch and trust what I have put in place." She looked me directly in the eyes, and I saw the fierce, protective love that had defined her entire life. "Promise me you'll protect this home, our home." "I promise, Mom," I whispered, my throat tight with emotion. She smiled, a genuine, relieved smile that reached her tired eyes. "Good. Now, that's settled. Tell me about that new collection you're archiving, the one with all the old city maps." We spent the rest of the afternoon talking about my work, about her garden, about everything and nothing. It was the last truly peaceful time we had together. 3 months later, I was standing in that same sunroom, surrounded by condolence cards and the scent of funeral lilies, the memory of that promise echoing in the silence. Marcus and Jenna were in the kitchen, their voices low and conspiratorial. They were already acting as if they owned the place. I held on to my mother's words, a quiet promise against the coming storm. I knew this was just the beginning, and I knew I had to be smart. My mother was counting on it. The day of the will reading was gray and damp, the kind of weather that seeps into your bones and mirrors the grief in your heart. We gathered in the polished mahogany office of Mr. Alastair Finch, a man who had been our family's lawyer for over 40 years. He had a kind, weary face, etched with the stories and secrets of countless families. He looked at me with an expression of gentle sympathy as I sat down. Marcus and his wife, Jenna, took the chairs opposite us, their demeanor a stark contrast to the somber occasion. Marcus was dressed in a suit that was just a little too shiny, a car salesman's armor. He had a look of barely contained impatience, like a man waiting for a deal to close. Jenna sat beside him, wringing her hands, her eyes darting around the room, avoiding my gaze. She was a follower, always echoing Marcus's ambitions and anxieties. They didn't look like they were mourning. They looked like they were waiting for a payout. Mr. Finch cleared his throat, the sound loud in the quiet room. He opened a leather-bound folder on his desk. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Helen Miller. Before I begin, I want to express my deepest condolences to you both. Your mother was a remarkable woman, and it was my privilege to know her." I murmured a quiet, "Thank you." Marcus just nodded curtly. "Let's get on with it, Alastair. It's been a long week." Mr. Finch's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly at the use of his first name, but he maintained his professional composure. "Very well. I have here the official will, signed by Helen on April 12th of this year, witnessed by 2 of my paralegals, and filed correctly with the county." He began to read. The legal language was dense, but the core of it was exactly what my mother had told me in the sunroom. There were some small bequests to charities she supported, the local animal shelter, and the public library. Then came the part about her children. "To my son, Marcus Miller," Mr. Finch read, "I bequeath the sum of $50,000. It is my hope that he uses this to secure his family's future and find stability." Marcus's face tightened. 50,000 was a lot of money, but it was a pittance compared to the value of the house and our mother's savings, which I knew were substantial. He shot a dark look at Jenna, who looked pale. Mr. Finch continued, his voice steady. "Regarding the family home located at 45 Elm Street, all its contents, and the remainder of my savings and investment accounts, I bequeath them in their entirety to my daughter, Lucia Miller." The silence that followed was heavy and immediate. I kept my expression neutral, my hands folded calmly in my lap, but my heart was pounding. This was the moment my mother had warned me about. Marcus let out a short, sharp laugh that was devoid of any humor. That's not right. That can't be right." "I can assure you, Marcus, this document is perfectly legal and was signed by your mother when she was of sound mind and body." Mr. Finch said calmly. No, Marcus said, standing up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a single sheet of paper, waving it dramatically. This is what's right. This is my mother's real final wish. He slapped the paper down on Mr. Finch's desk. I leaned forward slightly to see it. It was a simple, typed document, not much longer than a few paragraphs. At the bottom was a shaky, faint signature that was meant to be my mother, S. What is this? Mr. Finch asked, picking it up with a look of deep skepticism. That, Marcus declared, his voice ringing with false righteousness, is a codicil, a later addendum to the will. My mother wrote it about a month ago. She realized that since I was the one living here, taking care of her day in and day out, that I deserved the house. It's only fair. My blood ran cold. He had been taking care of her. I was the one who drove down every other weekend, who managed her doctor's appointments over the phone, who stayed for days at a time when she was feeling weak. Marcus and Jenna might have dropped off groceries once or twice, but their care was a performance, a prelude to this very moment. Mr. Finch read the document. His expression didn't change, but I could see a muscle twitching in his jaw. The document stated that in light of his dedicated care during her final months, Helen wished to amend her will to leave the house and the bulk of her savings to Marcus. It named me as the recipient of the $50,000 instead. It was a complete reversal. She knew I was the responsible one, Marcus continued, his voice swelling with self-importance. She knew Lucia was too far away, living her own life. Mom wanted the house to stay with the child who was actually there for her. That's her signature, right there. She signed it in front of me and Jenna. Jenna, on cue, nodded vigorously. That's right, she did. She said it was the right thing to do. I stared at the signature on the page. It was close, I had to give him that. He must have practiced. But it lacked the fluidity, the confident loop of the H that I knew so well. It was a forgery. A clumsy, arrogant forgery. I looked at Marcus, at his smug, triumphant face. He truly believed he had won. He thought his grand gesture, his piece of paper, would be enough to undo all of my mother's careful planning. He was counting on me to be emotional, to break down, to fight him and make a scene. He was expecting a storm. So I gave him silence. I met his gaze, held it for a long moment, and then gave a small, slow nod. I turned to Mr. Finch. Interesting, I said, my voice perfectly level. A flicker of confusion crossed Marcus's face. This wasn't the reaction he had anticipated. I wasn't screaming or crying. I wasn't accusing him. I was just calm. Inside, a cold, hard anger was solidifying into resolve, but on the surface, I was the quiet archivist, observing a historical document of questionable authenticity. And deep down, I was hiding a smile. Because my mother, the practical, no-nonsense retired nurse, had been smarter than him. She had known her son perfectly, and in her quiet way, she had prepared me for this exact betrayal. He had his piece of paper, but I had something much better. I had her final whisper, her quiet promise, and a plan she had set in motion long before Marcus ever picked up a pen to fake her name. After the disastrous meeting at Mr. Finch's office, Marcus and Jenna immediately went back to the house and began acting as if it were already theirs. I knew arguing with them would be pointless. Marcus was high on his perceived victory, and any protest from me would only be dismissed as the sour grapes of a disinherited daughter. So, I played my part. I told them I needed to gather some of my personal belongings and would be out of their way soon. My quiet compliance seemed to bolster their confidence, making them even more careless. "Take your time, Lucia," Marcus had said, his tone dripping with false magnanimity. "We know this is a shock for you." Jenna was already walking through the living room, pointing at furniture and talking about paint colors. It was nauseating, but it was also exactly what I needed. Their arrogance was my shield. It allowed me to move through the house without suspicion while I looked for what my mother had told me to find. My mother's final instructions hadn't been just about being smart and trusting the lawyer. In our last conversation in the sunroom, After she'd made me promise to protect the house, she had added one more cryptic detail. "If Marcus tries anything foolish," she had said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, "and I mean anything, look in the cedar chest. The key is in the sugar bowl, the one from England that your grandmother adored." The cedar chest sat at the foot of the bed in her bedroom. It was a heavy, dark wood antique that had been in our family for generations, and it always smelled faintly of lavender and old memories. Growing up, it was where she kept precious things: my grandfather's war medals, my father's baby shoes, and her own wedding dress, sealed in protective plastic. The sugar bowl was part of a delicate porcelain tea set that sat on a high shelf in the dining room cabinet, untouched for years. While Marcus and Jenna were in the backyard measuring the patio for a new grill, I slipped into the dining room. My hands were steady as I reached for the bowl. Tucked inside, beneath a fine layer of dust, was a small, ornate brass key. I went upstairs to her bedroom. The room was just as she'd left it. Her reading glasses were on the night stand next to a book of poetry. The air still held a faint trace of her rose-scented lotion. A wave of grief washed over me, sharp and sudden, but I pushed it down. I had a promise to keep. I knelt before the cedar chest and inserted the key. The lock turned with a satisfying, solid click. Lifting the heavy lid, I was met with the familiar scent of cedar and lavender. On top lay her wedding dress, a time capsule of hope and happiness from decades ago. I carefully lifted it out and set it on the bed. Beneath it were old photo albums and stacks of letters tied with ribbon. I wasn't looking for those. I was looking for what she had hidden. Tucked away in a corner, beneath a stack of my old report cards, was a large manila envelope. My name, Lucia, was written on it in my mother's elegant, familiar script. My heart began to beat faster. This was it. I opened the envelope and pulled out the contents. There were several items inside. The first was a handwritten letter, several pages long, addressed to me. "My dearest Lucia," it began. "If you are reading this, it means Marcus has done something exactly as I feared. I am so sorry you have to deal with this, but I knew I couldn't leave you unprepared. Your brother has a weakness for the easy path, and I fear his greed has finally eclipsed his love for this family. The piece of paper he is likely waving around is a fraud, and I have taken steps to prove it." The letter went on to explain everything. About 6 months ago, after Marcus had tried to get her to sign some papers that would give him power of attorney, she became deeply suspicious. She knew he was capable of anything. So, she started documenting. Inside the envelope with the letter was a small, spiral-bound notebook. It was a simple daily journal. In it, my mother had meticulously recorded every interaction she had with Marcus and Jenna for the last 6 months of her life. She noted the dates they visited, the duration of their stays, usually less than an hour, and the topics of their conversations, which almost always revolved around money or the house. October 14th, Marcus and Jenna stopped by. Didn't ask how my doctor's appointment went. Marcus talked for 20 minutes about how a developer offered his neighbor double the market value for his property. He looked at me as if waiting for me to take the hint. November 2nd, Jenna brought over a casserole. It was store-bought. She spent the visit talking about their credit card debt and how a new car for Marcus would really help his sales numbers. I gave her $200 for their groceries. She didn't say thank you. December 10th, Marcus came alone. He brought a document for me to sign, said it was just a formality for his bank. I read it. It would have made him co-owner of my checking account. I told him I'd have Mr. Finch look at it first. He got angry and left in a huff. Reading her neat, precise handwriting, a clear picture of my brother's predatory behavior emerged. He wasn't a caregiver. He was a vulture, circling, waiting. My mother, even in her weakened state, had been a silent, diligent witness to her own son's greed. She was building a case against him. But there was more. The most important piece of evidence was at the bottom of the envelope. It was another document, this one sealed in a plastic sleeve. It was a sworn affidavit from her oncologist, Dr. Evans, dated 2 weeks before her death, well after the supposed codicil was signed. The affidavit stated that due to the progression of her illness and the medication she was on, my mother had significant tremors in her hands and had lost the ability to write or sign her name legibly. In fact, for the last month of her life, she could only make a simple X on documents, which had to be witnessed by a nurse. My breath caught in my throat. The faint, shaky signature on Marcus's forged document was an impossibility. My mother physically could not have signed it. Marcus, in his arrogance, had tried to mimic the shakiness of an ill person, but in doing so, he had created a signature that a medical expert had already legally testified she was incapable of producing. The final item in the envelope was a small, labeled key. The label read, "Bank Deposit Box, City Central Bank." The letter explained, "Mr. Finch has one key and this is the other. Inside the box are several things he doesn't know about. I wanted a final layer of security, something only you would know. These are copies of Marcus's loan applications, where he forged my signature as a cosigner years ago, and my bank statements showing the money I gave him that he claimed were loans but never repaid. It shows a long-standing pattern of financial deceit. Use it if you must. Your father and I worked too hard to have it all stolen by his foolishness." I sat on the floor of my mother's bedroom, the evidence spread out before me. This was more than just a will. This was my mother's final act of love, a meticulously prepared toolkit for justice, left for her archivist daughter to discover. She had not only anticipated the betrayal, she had armed me against it. A cold, calm certainty settled over me. Marcus thought he was playing a simple game of greed. He had no idea he was walking into a carefully laid trap, set by the very woman he had so grievously underestimated. Armed with the contents of the cedar chest, my mission shifted. It was no longer just about defending my inheritance. It was about honoring my mother's foresight and exposing the full extent of Marcus's deception. My grief, which had been a heavy, suffocating blanket, now felt like fuel. I was an archivist, and my mother had left me her final, most important collection to curate, the evidence of my brother's character. My first step was to visit Mr. Finch, but I didn't go immediately. I needed to assemble everything in a way that was clear, concise, and undeniable. I spent the next 2 days in my apartment, turning my small living room into a command center. I scanned every page of my mother's journal, creating a digital backup. I transcribed her entries into a chronological timeline, cross-referencing them with my own calendar of visits. The contrast was damning. My timeline showed consistent, multi-day stays, while hers documented Marcus's fleeting, transactional appearances. Next, I focused on the affidavit from Dr. Evans. This was the cornerstone of my As against the forged codicil. A sworn medical statement was not something Marcus could argue against with bluster and charm. It was a cold, hard fact, and it proved his document was a physical impossibility. The final piece was the safety deposit box. The following morning, I called Mr. Finch. I kept my tone neutral, simply stating that I had found some of my mother's personal papers and would like to meet with him to review them. I did not mention the forgery or the journal. I needed to see his reaction to ensure he was the steadfast ally my mother believed him to be. We met in his office, the same room where Marcus had staged his dramatic performance. This time, it felt different. It was no longer a room of grief, but a courtroom in waiting. "Lucia, thank you for coming in," he said, his expression grave. "I must confess, I have been deeply troubled by the document Marcus presented. I have my suspicions, of course, but without concrete evidence." "I believe I have some," I said quietly, opening my satchel. I started by presenting him with the key to the safety deposit box. "My mother left this for me. She said you have the other key." Mr. Finch's eyebrows shot up in surprise. She never mentioned a box. Helen was always full of surprises. An hour later, we were in the sterile, silent vault of City Central Bank. The metal box felt heavy with secrets. Mr. Finch and I opened it together. Inside, just as my mother's letter had promised, were copies of old loan documents. I saw Marcus's looping, arrogant signature next to a poorly forged version of our mother's. There were at least 3 separate instances, dating back over a decade. Alongside them were highlighted bank statements showing large transfers to Marcus's account, with handwritten notes from my mother in the margins. Loan for Marcus car repair. Loan for Marcus credit card debt. There were no corresponding statements showing any repayment. Mr. Finch stared at the documents, his face grim. This establishes a clear pattern of financial exploitation. For years. "There's more," I said. Back in his office, I finally showed him my mother's journal. He read it in silence, his expression hardening with every page. He saw the calculated visits, the constant pressure for money, the blatant disregard for her well-being. He was reading a detailed account of emotional and financial abuse, written in the victim's own hand. "She documented everything," he breathed, looking up from the notebook. "Everything." Finally, I placed the sealed plastic sleeve containing Dr. Evans's affidavit on his desk. "And this, I believe, is the end of my brother's claim." Mr. Finch read the affidavit, then read it again. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes, letting out a long, weary sigh. When he looked at me, his eyes were filled with a mixture of sorrow and admiration. "Your mother was a brilliant woman, Lucia, truly brilliant. She knew her son's character, and she armed you perfectly. This affidavit makes the codicil null and void. The signature is a confirmed forgery, not just a suspected one, but a medically impossible one." He leaned back in his chair. "Marcus has done more than just attempt to defraud you. Forging a legal document like a will or a codicil is a serious crime. He could face prosecution." The word prosecution hung in the air. Part of me, the part that still remembered the big brother who taught me how to ride a bike, flinched. But then I remembered his smug face in this very office, the casual cruelty of his deception, and the way he and Jenna were already redecorating our family home in their minds. My mother had asked me to be smart, not sentimental. "What are our next steps?" I asked, my voice steady. "The next step," Mr. Finch said, a new, steely tone in his voice, "is to let Marcus and his lawyer know that we are challenging the legitimacy of the codicil. We will present them with a copy of this affidavit. I suspect, when faced with irrefutable proof of his forgery and the threat of criminal charges, he will withdraw his claim very, very quickly." He paused, looking at the evidence spread across his desk, the journal, the old forgeries, the medical statement. He thought he was just cheating his sister. He never realized he was going up against his mother. Leaving his office that day, I felt a profound sense of peace. My mother had given me more than a house and some money. She had given me a final gift, the truth, and now it was my turn to deliver it. The investigation was over. It was time to set the stage. The week that followed our visit to the bank was a quiet flurry of strategic activity. Mr. Finch and I worked together, a silent partnership between the living and the dead, with my mother as our invisible third partner. Our plan wasn't just to defeat Marcus. It was to dismantle his entire reality, to force him to confront the truth of his own actions in a way that was public and undeniable. We decided against a quiet backroom deal. My mother's name had been forged, her final wishes disregarded. The correction needed to be just as formal as the transgression. Mr. Finch scheduled a formal meeting with Marcus and his newly hired lawyer, a slick, local attorney named Greg Peterson, who had a reputation for aggressive, and often theatrical, tactics. The stated purpose of the meeting was to discuss the conflicting documents regarding the estate of Helen Miller. We gave them no hint of the mountain of evidence we possessed. We wanted them to walk into the room with the same arrogance and confidence they had displayed before. While Mr. Finch handled the legal preparations, my role was more personal. I spent time in the house. Marcus and Jenna, still blissfully unaware, had allowed me to continue packing my personal items. They saw me as a defeated sister, quietly retreating from a battle I had already lost. They would see me boxing up old books or sorting through photos and would offer condescending sympathies. "It must be so hard, Lucia," Jenna said one afternoon, watching me wrap my mother's porcelain tea set. "But you know, Helen was just not herself at the end. She probably forgot she'd even signed the new papers for Marcus. Probably, I replied, my voice placid, as I carefully placed the English sugar bowl, the one that had hidden the key, into a box. The irony was a secret I savored. Their condescension was a gift. It allowed me to move through the house freely, not just packing, but also preparing. I knew the final confrontation would be at Mr. Finch's office, but the house was the heart of the matter. It was the prize Marcus had coveted, and it was my mother's sanctuary. I wanted to make sure her presence was felt, even after the legal battle was over. During those days, I did more than pack. I spoke with my mother's neighbors, the ones who had known our family for decades. I didn't mention the will, but I listened to their stories. Mrs. Gable from next door told me how she'd often see my car in the driveway on weekends, but had only seen Marcus's for brief, sporadic visits. Mr. Henderson from across the street mentioned how my mother had confided in him that she was worried about Marcus's financial recklessness. These weren't legally binding testimonies, but they painted a picture, a community's understanding of the truth. They confirmed that Marcus's narrative of the devoted, caregiving son was a complete fiction. My most important preparation, however, was for myself. I reread my mother's journal one last time, not as a piece of evidence, but as a daughter reading her mother's final words. I saw her strength, her clarity, and her fierce, protective love. She wasn't a victim. She was a woman who had faced her own mortality and still found the strength to protect her child and her legacy. Her courage became my courage. I also thought about Marcus. I thought about the brother he used to be and the man he had become. The path of forgiveness seemed impossibly distant, but I knew my mother wouldn't want me to be consumed by hatred. My goal was not to destroy him, but to stop him, to hold him accountable for his choices, and to protect what our parents had built. This wasn't about revenge, I told myself. It was about justice. It was about honoring a promise made in a sun-drenched room filled with flowers. The day before the meeting, I found a small, framed photo that had fallen behind the dresser in my old bedroom. It was of Marcus and me as children, sitting on the front steps of the house. He had his arm around me, a goofy, protective grin on his face. I was looking up at him with total adoration. A pang of sadness hit me, a grief for a relationship that had been lost long before our mother died. I packed the photo away. It was part of the history of our family, a history that, like the documents I worked with every day, told a complex and sometimes painful story. On the morning of the meeting, I chose my outfit with care. A simple, dark gray dress, professional and understated. I was not a grieving daughter anymore. I was an archivist presenting her findings. My satchel contained my files, the timeline, the digital copy of the journal, the bank records, and, of course, the affidavit. I met Mr. Finch at his office half an hour early. He had already set up the conference room. 2 stacks of documents sat on our side of the large mahogany table. The other side was empty. "Are you ready?" he asked, his voice calm and reassuring. I took a deep breath and looked at the empty chairs where my brother and his lawyer would soon sit. I thought of my mother, of her steady gaze in the sunroom. I felt like she was standing right there beside me. "Yes," I said, my voice clear and strong. "I'm ready." The stage was set. The audience was about to arrive. And the truth, carefully cataloged and preserved, was waiting patiently in a manila folder. Marcus and his lawyer, Greg Peterson, strode into the conference room with an air of unassailable confidence. Marcus gave me a brief, dismissive nod, while Peterson smiled, a predatory gleam in his eyes. He was a man who clearly relished a fight. They sat down, and Peterson placed his pristine leather briefcase on the table with a soft thud. "Alistair Lucia," Peterson began, his voice smooth as silk. "I hope we can resolve this matter quickly and amicably. My client Marcus simply wants to honor his mother's final, documented wishes. The codicil is clear." Mr. Finch leaned forward, his hands steepled on the table. "Greg, we have a significant problem with that document. We are here today to present evidence that the codicil is not only invalid, but is, in fact, a fraudulent document." Peterson's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, Marcus scoffed. Fraudulent? My mother signed that. I was there. Jenna was there. Are you calling my wife and me liars? I am not calling you anything, Marcus, Mr. Finch replied, his tone icy. I am going to present you with facts, and then you can draw your own conclusions. With that, Mr. Finch slid a single file across the table. Let's start with this. It's an affidavit from Dr. Evans, your mother's oncologist. Perhaps you'd like to read it. Peterson opened the file. Marcus leaned over his shoulder to read. I watched their faces as they scanned the document. I saw the exact moment the words registered. Peterson's face went blank. The professional mask of a lawyer realizing his case has just evaporated. Marcus's confident smirk dissolved, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed expression of disbelief. The medical terminology was clear and unforgiving. Severe peripheral neuropathy, significant hand tremors. Incapable of forming a legible signature. This is ridiculous, Marcus stammered, his voice losing its bluster. She had good days and bad days. This doctor doesn't know what he's talking about. He was her lead physician for 2 years, Mr. Finch said flatly. His sworn testimony, I assure you, will hold up in court. The signature on your document is a physical impossibility. It is a forgery. And forgery of a testamentary document is a felony, carrying a penalty of up to 3 years in prison. The room was silent. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Peterson closed the file slowly, his face a grim mask. He looked at Marcus, and I could see the silent, furious communication passing between them. He had been lied to by his own client. But we're not going to stop there, Mr. Finch continued, his voice relentless. He slid a second, much thicker, binder across the table. This is a copy of your mother's personal journal from the last 6 months of her life. Marcus's eyes widened in horror. In it, Mr. Finch went on, she meticulously documented your visits. Or, perhaps more accurately, your lack thereof. She details your constant requests for money. She describes your attempt to have her sign over power of attorney. It paints a very clear picture, not of a devoted caregiver, but of a son who was relentlessly pressuring his terminally ill mother for financial gain. I watched Marcus as his face cycled through shock, anger, and finally, a desperate panic. The narrative he had built for himself, the lie he had told so often he probably started to believe it, was being systematically torn down before his eyes. And finally, Mr. Finch said, pushing one last file forward. We took the liberty of visiting your mother's safety deposit box. Inside, she kept excellent records. For example, these copies of loan applications from 2011 and 2015, where you appear to have forged her signature as a co-signer. This is a pattern of behavior, Marcus, a long-standing one. Greg Peterson held up a hand looking pale. Alistair, perhaps my client, and I need a moment to confer. By all means, Mr. Finch said, leaning back in his chair. Peterson grabbed a visibly shaking Marcus by the arm and practically pulled him out of the room. Their angry, whispered argument was audible through the thick wooden door. We sat in silence, waiting. The power in the room had shifted so completely it was palpable. 10 minutes later, they returned. Peterson's face was stone. Marcus looked defeated, his eyes red-rimmed, refusing to look at me. My client, Peterson said, his voice stiff and formal, has decided to withdraw his claim. He will not be submitting the codicil for probate. We accept the validity of the original will as read. A wise decision, Mr. Finch said calmly. However, Peterson continued, my client formally requests that his sister, Lucia, agree not to pursue criminal charges for the misunderstanding regarding the document. All eyes turned to me. This was my decision. I looked at my brother, truly looked at him. He was a 43-year-old man, hunched and broken, stripped of his lies. He wasn't a monster. He was just a weak man made corrupt by his own entitlement. Sending him to prison would serve no purpose. My mother hadn't wanted revenge, she wanted justice. And justice had been served. The truth was out. Her legacy was safe. I won't press charges, I said, my voice clear. On one condition. Marcus finally looked at me, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "You will accept the $50,000 as outlined in the will," I stated. "And you will never again ask me, or this family's estate, for another penny. You will take that money, pay your debts, and you will learn to stand on your own 2 feet. That is what Mom wanted." Marcus just nodded, unable to speak. "We accept the terms," Peterson said quickly. The meeting was over. They signed the necessary paperwork, their movements stiff and formal. As Marcus was leaving, he paused at the door and looked back at me. There was no apology in his eyes, only a deep, hollow resentment. He had not learned a lesson, he had only lost a game. And in that moment, I knew that the bond between us, already frayed for years, was irrevocably broken. I felt no triumph, only a quiet, profound sadness. My mother's true will had been revealed, her home was safe, and her final wishes would be honored. But the cost had been the last remaining shred of the family I once knew. In the weeks following the confrontation, the legal threads of my mother's estate were tied up neatly. Marcus accepted his inheritance with a signed document acknowledging it as his full and final claim. He and Jenna were silent. There were no angry phone calls, no desperate appeals. It was as if a switch had been flipped. The moment their path to easy money was blocked, their interest in the family vanished completely. They cashed the check, and they disappeared from my life. I took a leave of absence from my job and stayed at the house that was now mine. At first, it felt vast and empty, haunted by the echoes of the recent conflict. Every room held a memory, both good and bad. I saw my mother in her sunroom, heard my father's laughter in the hallway, and saw the ghost of my brother's greed in the living room where Jenna had been planning her redecoration. Slowly, carefully, I began to reclaim the space. I wasn't erasing the past, but curating it, much like I did at work. I packed away the things that brought a sting of pain, storing them in the attic. I brought out the things that brought joy. I filled the house with photos of my mother smiling, of my father and me at the lake, of family holidays from a time before the cracks began to show. The sunroom became my sanctuary once again. I learned the intricate watering schedules for her orchids and found a quiet joy in tending to the life she had so lovingly cultivated. I would sit in her wicker chair in the mornings, drinking my tea and watching the finches, feeling her presence not as a sad memory, but as a comforting, steadying force. She had left me more than a house. She had left me a home, and the peace that came with it. One afternoon, while cleaning out a desk drawer, I found a small, velvet pouch. Inside was a simple silver locket. I opened it. On one side was a tiny picture of my father. On the other, a picture of a much younger me and Marcus, the same one I had found behind the dresser, of him with his arm around me. My mother had kept it all these years. It was a reminder that the family had once been whole, that the love had been real. It didn't excuse what Marcus had done, but it provided a context, a quiet testament to the tragedy of what had been lost. I decided not to sell the house. I couldn't. It was the last tangible piece of my parents, a library of our shared history. Instead, I made arrangements to work remotely more often, allowing me to split my time between my apartment and my childhood home. It was the best of both worlds, my quiet, independent life and the deep, grounding roots of my family's legacy. About 6 months later, I received a card in the mail. It was a generic thank you card, and inside was a short, stilted note from Jenna. She wrote that they had put a down payment on a small condo in a town a few hours away. Marcus had a new job at a different dealership. The note didn't contain an apology, but it did have one line that stuck with me. "Marcus is in counseling. He's trying to work on things." I didn't know if it was true or if it would last. I didn't know if he would ever truly understand the depth of his betrayal. But it was a flicker of something, a hint that perhaps the shock of hitting rock bottom had forced him to finally look at the man he had become. I felt no desire to reach out, but I did feel a quiet, distant hope that he might one day find his way back to being a better man. Forgiveness was not on the table, but I could hope for his eventual redemption, for his own sake. My mother's legacy was honored. Her home was safe, filled with light and life. Her final wishes were respected. The bond with my brother, however, was broken, perhaps forever, and I had come to accept that. Some things, once shattered, cannot be fully repaired. You can only sweep up the pieces and build something new and strong in the space that's left behind. I am an archivist. My work is to preserve truth. In the end, this was my most personal project, preserving the truth of my mother's love, and in doing so, finding my own strength and peace.